Dad screamed, "You're ungrateful. Get out and don't come back." So I did. 1 week later, Mom texted, "The mortgage is past due. Why haven't you paid?" I just replied, "Didn't you say I wasn't welcome?" And that's when my phone blew up. I, 29M, was told to leave and never come back. So I did exactly that. The front door slammed behind me with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. My father's voice was still ringing in my ears, that final venomous shout about how ungrateful I was, how I needed to get out and never come back. The neighbors probably heard every word. I stood on the porch for a moment, my duffel bag in one hand, car keys in the other, waiting to see if he'd come after me to take it back. He didn't. I drove to a motel that night, one of those budget places on the highway with flickering neon signs and stained carpets. It smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner, but it was a roof over my head. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone, half expecting an apology text from my mother or maybe even from him. Nothing came. The silence was deafening. For context, I'd been living at home for the past 3 years. Not because I was some deadbeat lounging around playing video games, but because my parents had asked me to move back in. My father had been diagnosed with a heart condition, and my mother wasn't handling the stress well. They needed help with the mortgage, the bills, the upkeep of the house. My younger brother had moved across the country for work and wasn't contributing anything. My sister was in graduate school, drowning in student loans. That left me. So I came back. I took a job that paid decently but required brutal hours. I covered the mortgage every month without fail, paid for groceries, handled repairs when things broke down, drove my father to his medical appointments when my mother was too overwhelmed. I put my own life on hold. My girlfriend at the time left me because I was never available, always tied up with family obligations. I stopped seeing friends. I became a ghost in my own life, existing only to keep my parents' household afloat. And for 3 years, it worked. We had a routine. I wasn't happy, but I told myself it was temporary, that I was doing the right thing. My parents seemed grateful at first. My mother would thank me for covering the bills. My father would occasionally acknowledge my help with a stiff nod. But over time, the gratitude faded. They started treating my contributions like they were expected, like I owed them this. When I'd mention needing to save money to eventually move out again, my mother would get anxious, and my father would snap at me for being selfish. The explosion happened over something so stupid, it's almost laughable. I'd forgotten to pick up my father's prescription refill on my way home from work. I'd been pulling 14-hour shifts that week, barely sleeping, and it just slipped my mind. When I walked in that evening, exhausted and starving, my father was waiting in the living room like a judge at sentencing. He started in on me immediately. I'd been irresponsible, unreliable, thoughtless. My mother stood in the doorway to the kitchen, wringing her hands but saying nothing in my defense. I tried to explain that I'd pick it up first thing in the morning, that I'd just forgotten this once, but he wasn't hearing it. The argument escalated. He brought up every small mistake I'd made in the past 3 years, every time I'd been late with dinner or hadn't mowed the lawn exactly when he wanted. I finally snapped back, pointing out that I'd been supporting them financially for years while sacrificing my own future. That's when he lost it completely. He told me I was ungrateful for everything they'd done raising me, that I was throwing their generosity back in their faces. Generosity. The word made my blood boil. I'd paid their mortgage, kept their utilities on, made sure they had food in the fridge, and he called it generosity. Before I could respond, he shouted that I needed to get out and not come back. My mother just stood there, silent. So I left. The first few days at the motel were strange. I kept expecting my phone to ring, for my mother to call and say it had all been a misunderstanding, that I should come home. But the days passed in silence. I started looking for an apartment, something small and cheap that I could afford on my own. The freedom was intoxicating at first. No more walking on eggshells, no more monitoring my father's moods, no more guilt trips from my mother. I could breathe. But there was also this hollow feeling in my chest, this sense of disbelief that it had actually happened. 3 years of my life dedicated to keeping their world stable, and I'd been thrown out over a forgotten prescription. I didn't cry about it. I just felt numb. On day 8, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. My stomach tightened when I saw her name on the screen. I opened it. "The mortgage payment is past due. Why haven't you paid it?" I stared at the message for a long moment, reading it over and over. No apology. No concern for where I was or how I was doing. just a demand to know why I hadn't paid their bill. The audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. Did she actually expect me to keep paying after what had happened? After my father had kicked me out, I typed out a response, my hands steadier than I expected. Didn't you say I wasn't welcome? I hit send and put my phone face down on the table. For about 30 seconds, there was nothing. Then it started. My phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Calls from my mother, back to back. Texts from her, from my father, from my sister, who suddenly materialized out of her grad school bubble. Voicemails piled up faster than I could clear them. I didn't answer. I let them all go to voicemail, let the texts pile up unread. I finished my coffee, showered, and went to work. When I finally checked my phone during lunch, there were over 40 missed calls and a string of messages that ranged from panic to furious. My mother's texts were frantic. She needed to talk to me immediately. The bank was threatening foreclosure. How could I do this to them? My father's messages were shorter, angrier. I was being childish and petty. I needed to grow up and handle my responsibilities. My sister chimed in, telling me I was tearing the family apart, that I needed to be the bigger person and fix this. I deleted them all without responding. That evening, my brother called. We hadn't spoken in months, not since before I'd moved back home. He distanced himself from the family drama, built a life across the country where he didn't have to deal with any of it. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. He asked what was going on, said our mother had called him in hysterics about the mortgage. I gave him the short version, the highlights of the past 3 years and the blowout that had ended with me being kicked out. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he asked if I was serious about not going back. I told him I was dead serious. He surprised me by saying he didn't blame me. He admitted that he'd stayed away on purpose, that he'd watched me get sucked into being their caretaker and had been relieved it wasn't him. He felt guilty about it now, but not guilty enough to get involved. He wished me luck and said he'd stay out of it. Then he hung up. At least he was honest. The calls and texts continued for days. My mother tried every angle. Guilt, anger, pleading, bargaining. She reminded me that they'd raised me, fed me, clothed me, put a roof over my head. She conveniently forgot that I'd been doing the same for them for 3 years. My father's messages were less frequent, but more venomous. He called me selfish, spiteful, a disappointment. He said I'd regret this, that I'd come crawling back when I realized how good I'd had it. I blocked both of them after the first week. My sister tried to play mediator. She called me from campus, her voice tight with stress. She told me I needed to reconsider, that our parents were in real trouble. The bank had sent a foreclosure notice. They couldn't afford the mortgage on their own. She asked if I really wanted to be the reason they lost their house. I asked her if she'd be willing to cover the payments. The line went quiet. She stammered something about her student loans, how she was barely scraping by as it was. I told her that was exactly how I'd felt for the past 3 years, except I'd actually done something about it. She got defensive, said it wasn't the same thing, that I'd made a commitment when I moved back in. I reminded her that Dad had told me to leave and never come back, that I was just honoring his wishes. She hung up on me. I found an apartment 2 weeks after leaving. It was small, barely big enough for a bed and a couch, but it was mine. I signed the lease and moved in with a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. No more tension hanging in the air, no more waiting for the next argument to erupt. I could come home after work and just exist without justifying my every move. The guilt tried to creep in at night. I'd lie awake wondering if I was doing the right thing, if I was being too harsh. But then I'd remember my father's face when he'd screamed at me to get out, the way my mother had just stood there and let it happen. I'd remember the 3 years of thankless sacrifice, the relationships I'd lost, the opportunities I'd passed up. The guilt would fade, replaced by a cold, hard certainty that I'd made the right choice. Update 1. It's been 6 weeks since I walked out. The calls and texts from blocked numbers eventually stopped. I changed my number just to be safe and only gave it to a handful of people I trusted. My brother knew better than to pass it along. My sister tried to get it from a mutual friend, but I'd warned everyone in advance not to share it with family. I heard through the grapevine that my parents were scrambling. My mother had apparently reached out to distant relatives asking for money, spinning some story about unexpected medical bills. A few people lent her small amounts before word got around about what had actually happened. My father, too proud to beg, had apparently tried to take on extra freelance work but wasn't getting much traction. The house went into foreclosure. I found out through a former neighbor who reached out on social media. She said she'd seen the notice posted on their door and wanted to know if I was okay. I thanked her for checking in and left it at that. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. Part of me expected to feel something when I heard the news. Triumph, maybe, or vindication. But mostly I just felt tired. This whole situation had drained something fundamental out of me. Some core belief that family was supposed to be there for you no matter what. I'd learned the hard way that family could be just as conditional as anything else. My life started to take shape in the new apartment. I picked up a second freelance gig on the side, working remotely in the evenings to build up my savings. Without the constant drain of my parents' expenses, my bank account actually started to grow. I reconnected with a few old friends I'd lost touch with, went out for drinks, remembered what it felt like to have a social life. I even went on a couple of dates, though nothing serious developed. It felt good to be living for myself again. Then, about 2 months in, my sister showed up at my apartment. I have no idea how she found my address. She must have done some serious detective work or called in favors. I opened the door one evening to find her standing there, looking exhausted and angry in equal measure. She demanded to know how I could let this happen, how I could stand by and watch our parents lose everything. I leaned against the doorframe and asked her why she thought any of this was my responsibility. She started in on the same arguments I'd heard before, family obligations and loyalty and doing the right thing. I let her finish, then asked her point-blank how much money she'd contributed to help them out. She admitted she hadn't sent anything. Her loans, her expenses, her own life struggles. I nodded and told her that was exactly my point. She'd kept herself at a safe distance while I'd sacrificed everything, and now that I'd finally drawn a boundary, everyone wanted to act like I was the villain. She stared at me for a long moment, her face cycling through about a dozen emotions. Then she turned and left without another word. I haven't heard from her since. Update 2. It's been 4 months now. I'm settled into my new life in a way that feels almost surreal. The apartment doesn't feel temporary anymore. I've made it mine, filled it with furniture I actually like, hung art on the walls. I got a promotion at work, something I'd been passed over for twice before because I'd been too burned out from dealing with family issues to perform at my best. The raise was substantial enough that I could finally start thinking about long-term goals again, maybe even going back to school or buying my own place someday. I ran into my mother at a grocery store last week. Pure chance, wrong place at wrong time. We locked eyes across the produce section, and for a second neither of us moved. She looked older than I remembered, more worn down. She approached me cautiously, like I might bolt. She asked how I was doing, her voice careful and measured. I told her I was fine. She said she wanted to talk, that there were things we needed to discuss. I asked if she was planning to apologize. She bristled at that, said she didn't think an apology was necessary given everything they'd done for me over the years. I felt that familiar anger rise up in my chest, but I kept my voice level. I told her that until she and my father were ready to acknowledge what they'd put me through, we had nothing to discuss. She tried to argue, but I cut her off. I told her I'd spent 3 years of my life keeping them afloat while they treated me like an obligation rather than a person. I reminded her that I hadn't chosen to leave, that I'd been thrown out, and that I was just respecting their wishes. Her face crumpled a little at that, but she didn't apologize. She just asked if I'd really let them end up on the street over pride. I told her it wasn't about pride. It was about self-respect. Then I walked away. My hands were shaking when I got back to my car, but not from guilt. From relief. I'd stood my ground, hadn't let her manipulate me back into the cycle. It felt like closing a door that had been hanging open for too long. I heard later through that same neighbor that my parents had managed to avoid foreclosure at the last minute. Some arrangement with the bank, a modified payment plan, or refinancing. I don't know the details. They're hanging on by a thread, apparently working multiple jobs between the two of them to keep up with bills. Part of me wonders if the struggle will teach them anything, if they'll eventually understand what they put me through. But honestly, I'm not holding my breath. The truth is, I don't think about them much anymore. My life has moved forward without them in it, and it's better this way. Quieter, healthier. I'm building something for myself now, something that isn't tied to anyone else's expectations or demands. I'm learning who I am outside of being their solution to every problem. I don't know if I'll ever reconcile with them. Maybe someday, if they're willing to actually own up to their behavior. But I'm not waiting around for that day. I'm not putting my life on hold anymore. I did that for 3 years, and it nearly broke me. They wanted me gone, so I'm gone. And I'm finally okay with that.